Well, let's start in Jeremiah chapter 3. Anybody need a handout for today? All right. Jeremiah chapter 3. Now, when you think about Old Testament prophets who speak about messianic things, which prophet do you think of first? Isaiah. Isaiah is filled with messianic elements and prophecies. And, hi, how are you? Good to see you. I didn't even see you there. We've got Tammy's mother with us today. I didn't even see her sitting there until just now. Wow, wonderful. Merry Christmas. Good to see you. We think of Isaiah. We don't think of Jeremiah as much, except for maybe the New Covenant passage of Jeremiah 31. But there are some other texts in Jeremiah that I think are clearly messianic in nature, looking forward to Jesus and his arrival and his kingdom. So, in chapter 3, let's start with the first one that I see in the book. So just kind of summarizing what the context is, God is talking about, beginning at verse 6, the northern kingdom of Israel and how faithless they have become, and then the punishment from Assyria that they experienced. And yet, despite the efforts of King Josiah in Judah to turn the southern kingdom to God, the nation did not entirely follow in his ways. And so we've talked about chapter 3 and verse 10, that Judah did not return with her whole heart, but rather in pretense or in deception. And then in verse 11, God says that faithless Israel in the north has proved herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. So here's what God says to the people of Judah, and this is the Messianic section beginning at verse 14. Return, O faithless sons, declares the Lord, for I am a master to you, and I will take you one from a city and two from a family, and I will bring you to Zion. Then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will feed you on knowledge and understanding. So, there's more to this, but the shepherds that God is talking about, in the Old Testament, the shepherds are often used to describe the leaders of a nation. So as the kings and the princes and the rulers of a nation are to be shepherds of the people, God says, your shepherds have not been that, by and large. And so I'm going to give you new shepherds who will look after you, who will feed you on knowledge and understanding. Now in verse 16, it shall be in those days when you are multiplied and increased in the land, they will no longer say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And it will not come to mind, nor will they remember it, nor will they miss it, nor will it be made again. At that time they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all the nations will be gathered to Jerusalem, for the name of the Lord. Nor will they walk any more after the stubbornness of their evil heart. And in those days the house of Judah will walk with the house of Israel, and they will come together from the land of the north to the land that I gave your fathers as an inheritance. Okay, let's focus on verse 16 for a moment. What does God say about the Ark of the Covenant in verse 16? What's going to happen to it? The people are going to forget about it. Now, does that strike you as odd? I mean, we're not talking about just a little glass vase here that somebody might set up in the corner of their house. We're talking about the most important piece of furniture in the temple. The piece of furniture wherein God resided in the temple. This was God's seat in the most holy place. This is the most important feature of the temple. And Jeremiah says, it won't even come to your mind. You're not even going to think about it. He says in verse 16, you won't remember it, you won't miss it, nor will it be made again. Does that suggest anything to you about the current condition of the Ark of the Covenant? It seems like it doesn't exist. Yeah, I think that's an implication of this verse. And I say that because, Indiana Jones went looking for it, right? And he found it. And it melted this guy's face. But Steven Spielberg, I think, who was the director of that movie, he's not the only one who kind of created a story here. People today still look for it. I guess they just missed this verse, because this seems to me to imply that it's been destroyed, probably in the destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar, and it doesn't exist anymore. And Jeremiah says, doesn't matter. It doesn't even need to be remade again. All right? So, God's going to reunite the nations that have been scattered. He's going to bring them back. The city of Jerusalem will be called the throne of the Lord. Notice that it says in verse 17, all the nations will be gathered to it. I think that moves us beyond application to just the Jews, right? All the nations will come to Zion because that's where the Lord is, and it will be a unified nation rather than a divided one. All right. Anything else here about this text that you find interesting or have a question about? All right. Let's go to chapter 23. You see this shepherd idea again in verses 1 and 2. Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture. So God is upset with the way his people have been led. He rebukes these shepherds for their negligence, and then he promises in verses 3 and 4 to bring shepherds who will rule over the people and will give them the leadership that he wants them to have. But specifically, there's one great shepherd who's going to come in verse 5. The days are coming, says the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely, and this is his name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. All right. You see that word branch in verse 5, raise up for David a righteous branch. If you want to do a little search sometime for that word in the Old Testament prophets, I would encourage you to do that. You'll see it in Isaiah, you'll see it in Zechariah, and in those cases, it's talking about the Messiah who's going to come. So when you see that word branch, think Jesus, all right? So there's kind of an interesting thing that's going on here that you wouldn't know unless you dig into this a little bit. This chapter, this message, it seems was most likely delivered during the reign of King Zedekiah, who was the final king. The name Zedekiah means the Lord is righteous. Zedekiah did not live up to the belief that his name suggests. He was, as you know, a terrible ruler and terrible king. But this new shepherd, this branch that's going to be raised up, his name in verse 6 will be the Lord our righteousness. So I think there's a little play there on Zedekiah's name. This passage is very similar to something we're going to see in Jeremiah chapter 33, which will be there in just a moment. But this idea of the Lord our righteousness and all that, we're going to see that again in just a minute. All right. Let me spare you a little time here. Okay, I told you to go and look for the word branch in other prophets. Let me just give you the references. So that way I'll save you a little time. If you want to look these up, you want to write these down. Isaiah 4 and verse 2. Isaiah 11, verse 1, and Zechariah 6 and verse 12. All right, did you get those? Need me to say them again? All right. Now let's go to chapter 30. Chapter 30 and verse 8. It shall come about on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off their neck. He's talking about Babylon, breaking Babylon's yoke off the neck of Judah. And I will tear off their bonds, and strangers will no longer make them their slaves, but they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. Now, we've talked about this a little bit already. We said that when the prophets talk about raising up David the king, they're not talking about literal King David, who's been dead for 2 or 3 years at this point. They're talking about this future coming Messiah who will reign in the likeness of King David. He will be similar to King David in his righteousness and in his love for God and his leadership and so forth. Yes, David had his flaws, but he was by far the best king that Israel ever had. But there's another element of significance to David the king, because Jesus comes from the lineage of King David, right? He is following in that lineage, and so God is going to fulfill that promise that he made to David, that one of his descendants would forever be seated on the throne. And Jesus is fulfilling that now into perpetuity. All right, one more. Chapter 33. And this is the one that I said on Wednesday I didn't want to spend any time on because we're going to spend more time on it today. This is the longest of the Messianic passages in Jeremiah. We're skipping over the New Covenant part of chapter 31 because we've already talked about that a good bit. So chapter 33, verses 14 through 26. You're going to see David's name several times here. Lots of things that we can talk about in this section. Verse 14, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the good word which I have spoken concerning the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth. Okay, you see that branch element again and the lineage of David again. A righteous branch of David to spring forth, and he shall execute justice and righteousness on the earth. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell in safety. And this is the name by which she will be called. The Lord is our righteousness. Okay, so I told you we were going to come back to that again. The Lord is our righteousness. But there's something subtly different about this, and Sandy picked up on it. What is it? All right. Here in chapter 33 and verse 16, it says, she will be called, the Lord is our righteousness. Who is it talking about? Who's the she? Who's the antecedent to the pronoun? Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem will be called, the Lord is our righteousness. Back in chapter 3, when we saw that expression, the Lord is righteous, who was it applied to there? Yeah, the coming Messiah. His name would be the Lord is righteous. So let's connect those two ideas. So you've got all these passages that we're looking at about God's people in Jerusalem dwelling securely and safely and blessings and prosperity and all this returning from bondage and all that. They're going to be in their land again. They're going to be led by this ideal king who, like David, is a strong leader and a godly man, but he's going to be even greater than David. He's so great, his name will be the Lord is righteous, which says something about he himself, doesn't it? Because he is the Lord himself, right? So, he is righteous. His very name is righteous, and his people live in the city, and the city itself is called the Lord is righteous, because he is there. Okay? All right. Now, verse 17. Thus says the Lord, David shall never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel. All right? That reiterates the promise that God made to David back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So all of this talk about a coming ruler who's going to come like David or from David, it's a reminder of God's promise to the nation. It's a reminder, well, God's promise to David, but it has an impact on the nation. God is saying, look, I know Babylon is destroying everything in your life, and I know that your world is being turned upside down, but I've not forgotten my promise. I've not forgotten what I said to David. And you may not be able to understand how I'm going to make all of this happen and how I'm going to fulfill my words, but I need you to trust me that I will. All right? So David, this promise, 17, will never lack a man to sit on the throne. And, verse 18, the Levitical priests shall never lack a man before me to offer burnt offerings, to burn grain offerings, and to prepare sacrifices continually. The Levitical priests will always have someone standing before me offering their sacrifices. Problem: how many Levitical priests are there today who are serving God, offering sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem? 0. Well, now wait a minute. What does it say? It says the Levitical priests will never lack a person standing and serving before God, offering sacrifices. So obviously, the Bible's wrong here, and we should just throw the whole thing out, right? What do we do with this? How do we explain this? All right, that's one way that we could think about it. That this is foreshadowing the priesthood of Jesus and the sacrifice that he gave on the cross and the continual mediation that he gives us. That's one way that we might deal with it. Any other thoughts?
Well, we've become priests today.
All right, there's another way we might deal with it, okay? And there's some commentators who view it that way, all right?
Hebrews talks a fair amount about that.
All right, so let me give you something else to think about. The things that God says through his prophets at whatever time they are speaking, God's messages have to be intelligible to the people of that time. So, in 587 or 588 BC, Jeremiah is preaching about restoration and hope and a future and God blessing his people again as they live in their land. That would, of course, imply the temple will be rebuilt. We will go back to our usual way of doing things. So as far as the temple and the worship therein was concerned, what was the usual way of doing things for them? Who would the priests be? The Levites, of course. Who else would it be? That's all they knew. So when God says the Levitical priests will never lack someone serving before me, that would be something that would make the Jews of Jeremiah's day be encouraged. Okay, the old ways are going to come again. You know, things are going to be restored again. If God had said through Jeremiah, you know, listen, my Jewish brothers and sisters, God is doing something wonderful. One of these days, God is going to, you're going to love this, everybody listen carefully, He's going to bring Gentiles into the temple, and it's going to be great. And they're all going to be priests who serve before God. Now, is that true? Yes, right? But what would the Jews of Jeremiah's day have thought about such a statement? He's going to do what? He's going to make priests from the Gentiles? What? Stone this guy. He's saying blasphemous things, right? So my point is, of course Jeremiah would talk about Levitical priests coming back. What else would the Jews have known? What consolation would it have been to them if he said, in the Messianic age, we're going to let the Gentiles into the club too, and we're going to let them share in all of this? That would have been such a foreign concept to them.
They weren't ready for that.
They weren't ready for that. Yeah, that's exactly right. So Jeremiah is using language that's intelligible to them in their time. So I don't think this poses a problem for us. Oh, well, God said that the Levites would always be serving before Him. And look, today, no. We've just given 1, 2, 3 explanations as to how we can understand this promise. So there's not a contradiction here. There's not a problem here. All right. Let me catch up to my notes here. So 5 years ago, I was asked to speak at a conference on Jeremiah, and my task was to talk about messianic elements of Jeremiah. And I had like a 12-page outline or something, or it was longer than that, I think, 17 or 18 pages maybe, and that's what I have here, so I'm trying to be like, no, don't talk about that. Yeah, let's make sure we talk about that. Okay, I'm trying to weed through all my junk here. All right. You might recognize the language that we're about to read. Verse 19. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah saying, Thus says the Lord, if you can break my covenant for the day and my covenant for the night, so that day and night will not be at their appointed time, then my covenant may also be broken with David my servant, so that he will not have a son to reign on his throne and with the Levitical priests, my ministers. Okay, do you remember talking a week or so ago where God was talking about this new covenant? And He said, just as, I'm paraphrasing, but just as surely as the ocean tide rises and falls, just as surely as the sun and moon rise and fall every day, that's how certain my covenant is. You remember talking about that? Okay, it's same idea, same language here. There's a certainty to the cycle of life. And here, he talks about the day and the night and how those have happened ever since creation. And he says, that's how certain my promises are to David and to these priests. All right. Let's close with the final thought of chapter 33, which closes the 4-chapter book of consolation. Verse 25. If my covenant for day and night stand not, and the fixed patterns of heaven and earth I have not established, then I would reject the descendants of Jacob and David my servant, not taking from his descendants rulers over the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I will restore their fortunes and will have mercy on them. Okay, he says the same thing, just flips it around into the negative. But a couple things I want you to notice. First, notice that he brings in verse 26, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He enlarges the scope of the story. These are not just promises that God is making to David and to the priests, to David, the king, that he would always have a king on the throne. These are not just promises to them. He reaches back and he says, look, I've been weaving together a story since Abraham. And I want you to remember the promises that I made to the patriarchs too. All of this is working together in congruence. And then the very last word of this book of consolation, the last sentence, I will restore their fortunes and will have mercy on them. And isn't that a fitting closing to this message where Jeremiah has been preaching doom and destruction for all of these years? And when in this book of consolation, these 4 chapters, it closes with, yes, but there's mercy in the end. And I think that's a really hopeful way for the nation to end this. Okay, let me see what else I've got here before I... Yeah, okay. All right, I'll stop with that stuff there. Let's draw on that last idea a little bit. when Jeremiah is proclaiming judgment and destruction and death, and yet he follows all of that with this message. Yes, but there's mercy in the end. I think that's something that we should take and make application of. There will be, maybe there are now, times in our lives where we feel like things are not going right. We feel like, even if we know better, we still may feel like God is against us, or that God is punishing us somehow. But with God, there's always mercy in the end. Do you remember reading all those statements from Lamentations, where Jeremiah is like surveying carcasses all over the land, and yet he still says, your mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I will speak of the loving kindness of the Lord. I mean, he says that as he's surveying thousands of dead bodies. How does he do that? Well, the only way you can do that is by knowing that with God, there's always mercy in the end. That God always finds a way to make things right and to make things work. And that's a implicit statement of trust, I think, that we have to hold on to. Okay. Let me stop here and do two things. One, Wednesday night, we spent a little time talking about this. I wrote this up here on Wednesday, and for those who were here, we spent, 10 minutes or so talking about some lessons and things that we've learned from Jeremiah. If you were not here Wednesday, I'd be curious to see if you have anything that you'd like to add to that. I say add to that, you don't know what we said Wednesday, but I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are if you have them. And if there's anything else that we've talked about today that maybe there's a question or a comment about, I'd like to address that while we have some time. Alan, you've got that look on your hands. It's like I'm about to say something. You're sitting there like this, like that's my like I'm about to say something expression. No, you're fascinated with everything I just said. Well, you're.
Now it's Ron.
No, I'm kind of at odds with Ron right now. Ron brought his snark in this morning, and he said some things that were kind of hurtful to me this morning. I knew he had something. I knew it.
And I won't go into any elaborate thing, but there is a connection between what you're talking about here in verse 26 in Romans chapter 11.
Oh, yeah, good. Okay, yeah, make that connection for us.
Well, Paul is kind of referencing this when God said there that if my covenant is not day and night, then I will cast the descendants of Jacob. Like you said, he's kind of looking at it in the negative there, saying, in other words, I'm not going to throw these people away. And Paul reiterates that there in Romans chapter 11. He said, I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite, the seed of Abraham and the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people, whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, the Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I am alone and left. And see, he goes on and he talks about the remnant that's there, the remnant that's there. What I kind of take from that is that God's remnant has always been there, from the time this was written all the way to today. God has always had his remnant. Now, I don't know in what capacity they existed. I know how the Church of Christ can kind of trace its history back to the Restoration movement, but that doesn't really we don't mark our existence at that point.
Right.
It's kind of brought back in the United States, and that God has always had his remnant that has existed throughout time. And with the way things are going now, we think, well, is the church going to die out? I think that so long as the Lord leaves this world standing, there will always be people that are faithful to him. They might be small in number, they might be scattered around, but God will always have and protect his remnant.
Yeah, that's a great point. That idea of a faithful remnant of people, I think, is as old as the book of Genesis. How many people were in the remnant when the flood came?
Yeah, it was 8.
8 people. There were only 8 people who were faithful to God on the face of the earth. So it seems. Yeah. But God has always had those people who do his will and that he blesses and takes care of in life or in death. And that's a great point. You're exactly right. Yeah, there's more I'd like to say about that, but I don't have time. So, okay. We did get some Romans in. Ron?
Yes.
You can share that with your kids.
I noticed that.
They snubbed my class to go to Romans upstairs. Little did they know, get some Romans downstairs. All right. Anything else? Okay. So, I need your help. That was just the first bell, I think. So I need your help. I've said everything that I really wanted to say about the Messianic stuff in Jeremiah. There's more we could talk about, but I don't want to take taffy and stretch it too thin, So, I would like for you to give me some feedback on what would you like to do for our last class period Wednesday? Are there other parts of Jeremiah that you feel like maybe we didn't sufficiently deal with? Or are there things that we need to go back and revisit because you have questions? Or should we go back and talk about the color-coded thing that you guys, all of you did, right? I know all of you did it, right? Right? Trying to lay on my sarcasm pretty thick there. I'm sure you picked that up. But we could talk about that for those of you who did it. Did you like it? Did you not like it? We can do a cafeteria-style class on Wednesday. So let me know what you'd like to do, preferably before 6 p.m. Wednesday. All right, Brittany? Brittany's going to get us started. Good.
Like community churches take Jeremiah 29:11. Like that's a big.
Oh, man, yeah. Preach, sister. I'm with you.
That's but sometimes it's a little.
Okay, now we did talk about that in one of our earlier classes. You guys might not have been here, or do you remember hearing me talk about that? Okay, maybe you guys weren't here that night or that time. We did briefly talk about that, but it's a great point. It's one of those coffee cup verses. That's what I call them. Jeremiah 29 and verse 10, I know the plans that I have for you, plans to give you a future and a hope and something like that. You go to Lifeway bookstore, if those even exist anymore, and you see that like 76 times. You see it on signs and coffee cups and T-shirts and stickers, and it's not really what it's about. It was written to a specific people and at a certain time and so forth. That's a good point. Maybe we can talk about that again. Seemed like I had something come into my mind. Now I've forgotten what it was. Okay. If it comes back, fine. Anything else? Oh, I know what it was. Do you feel like you've got a better grasp of Jeremiah now? I know that you're probably just saying that because, we're not going to say no. No, the quarter was terrible. But do you feel like you at least have some kind of working knowledge of the book? here's the situation, here's the times, here's what's going on, that kind of, I mean, you feel like you got a pretty decent grasp on it. I know that what we did in this quarter, studying it thematically, was different. And we jumped around and looked at different topics instead of just start at chapter 1 and go through. But did you like the way we approached it? Was that helpful?
So I did appreciate that. My only frustration is that if someone were just to sit down and read it, why is it so confusing? Like, why didn't they put it in order? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Oh, yeah.
because that makes it very confusing for the person that just says, this is, something I want to tackle, I want to read that book. And
Right.
just to read it from beginning to end, a normal book would be in.
Oh, to go from beginning to end, it's like, hey, chapter 1 is here, chapter 9 is here, chapter 6 is here, chapter 28 is here. Yeah, it's a nightmare. Which is why I didn't teach it, chronologically, just chapter 1 and go to chapter 52. Because I knew that would just be, I'm sorry?
Is there a reason?
Why it was compiled that way? I don't know that I have a good answer for that. The only thing that I could offer, and this quarter has kind of reinforced this for me, did you notice how many of our lessons were like 2 chapters in focus? And those 2 chapters would usually be related thematically. Okay, that happened for at least half of our lessons. Like chapter 27 and 28 would go together, and there's a story in those 2 chapters. It could be that the book was intended to be arranged topically. And so Jeremiah and Baruch and whoever else grouped them topically instead of chronologically. I think that's a possibility that we have to consider. I don't know that I can say that's exactly why, but it's a possibility. All right, if you have other questions about Jeremiah or other things, can we talk about this Wednesday? Text me, call me, email me. Don't send it snail mail. I won't get it by Wednesday, but let me know. All right? That was a lame attempt at a joke, I know. Thanks, everybody.